The restaurant always smelled like success. Polished marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and the faint sound of expensive laughter echoing between tables lined with crystal glasses. It was the kind of place where wealthy people came not just to eat, but to be seen. And in the middle of it all was Eli Carter, a young black waiter who moved through the crowd with quiet grace, balancing trays and swallowing his pride. Eli had been working at La Belle Maison for nearly 3 years. Every morning, he arrived early, polishing silverware, arranging cutlery, ensuring that each table was perfect. He was good at his job and he knew it. But no matter how hard he worked, he could never polish away the looks, the sneers, the small, cutting comments disguised as jokes. They came mostly from the regulars, lawyers, executives, the kind of people who ordered wine more expensive than Eli's monthly rent. They called him the help, in tones that made it sound like an insult. Sometimes they would wave him off mid-sentence, as though his voice didn't deserve space in their world. Other times they'd leave pennies instead of tips, laughing as they walked out, thinking it was funny. What hurt most wasn't their laughter. It was the silence from those around him. His coworkers, the management, even other servers who looked away. They weren't bad people, they were just scared. Nobody wanted to stand up for the black waiter when the people doing the mocking were the ones who kept the restaurant running with their money. Eli learned to keep his head down. He told himself it didn't matter, that one day he'd leave this place behind. But every insult left a bruise that didn't fade, and as he watched the same people treat him like a servant night after night, something inside him hardened, not into anger but into determination. He had dreams, though he rarely spoke of them. Before his mother passed away, she'd told him he could be anything he wanted. She'd been a housekeeper her whole life, cleaning other people's homes, raising their children, always smiling even when they didn't treat her kindly. One day, she had said, "You'll own something of your own." Eli had laughed then, but her words stayed with him. After work, when the restaurant closed, Eli would sit at the last table by the window. He'd watch the city lights flicker and read books about business, hospitality, entrepreneurship. He didn't have a degree or connections, but he had willpower. Every night, after cleaning tables, he studied menus from famous restaurants, learned how they worked, and took notes on how La Belle Maison ran its operations. He wanted to understand everything, the costs, the profits, the mistakes. Still, each morning he returned to the same reality, the same fake smiles, the same wealthy customers who treated him like furniture. Among them was one man who stood out, Richard Langford, a lawyer known for his arrogance and influence. Richard came often, always dressed in sharp suits, surrounded by colleagues who laughed too loudly and tipped too little. He had a habit of calling Eli boy, a word that stung no matter how many times Eli heard it. One Friday evening, Richard and his friends came in drunk from a corporate event. They took their usual corner table, the one Eli always dreaded serving. As Eli approached, their laughter grew. They mocked his uniform, his accent, his skin, as if he were invisible and couldn't hear them. One of them joked that he looked too comfortable for a waiter, as though ambition were a crime for someone like him. Eli didn't react. He couldn't. His manager stood just a few feet away, watching, pretending not to notice. The humiliation burned, but Eli refused to let it break him. He finished his shift in silence, his hands trembling as he wiped down the table where they'd sat. On the bill, they had left a tip, a single dollar folded into a napkin with the word "smile" written on it. That night, Eli went home and sat on his small bed, staring at the ceiling. Something inside him changed. The world he'd been taught to endure, he now wanted to overcome. The laughter that used to wound him now fueled him. He promised himself that one day, he would walk into La Belle Maison not as a waiter, but as its owner. From that night on, he began saving every dollar he could. He cut back on everything. No new clothes, no luxuries, just work and study. He started taking online business courses during his breaks. He reached out to local entrepreneurs, asking questions, learning how to start from nothing. It was exhausting, but he didn't stop. Every insult became a spark that pushed him forward. Meanwhile, the restaurant was changing too. Business was slowing, the decor was aging, and the management seemed more concerned with appearances than quality. Eli noticed every mistake, every missed opportunity. He knew that one day, those flaws would matter. 2 years passed like that. Long shifts, quiet nights, steady progress. Eli built a small catering business on the side, offering affordable but high-quality meals for local events. It started small, birthdays, church gatherings, weddings, but word spread fast. People loved his food, his professionalism, and his humility. Slowly, he began to build a name for himself. But success didn't come without pain. Some of his co-workers mocked his ambition, calling him the dreamer. Others warned him that people like him didn't get far in business. Yet Eli kept moving forward, step by step, fueled by every memory of humiliation he had endured in that restaurant. Then, one ordinary morning, something unexpected happened. The manager gathered the staff for an announcement. La Belle Maison was struggling financially. The owners were looking to sell. Eli's heart skipped a beat. The same restaurant that once made him feel small, the place that reminded him of every cruel laugh and demeaning comment, was about to be up for sale. It was too soon, too big, too impossible. Or was it? As he stood in that familiar dining hall, surrounded by the same faces that once looked past him, Eli felt something shift inside him. Fate, it seemed, was giving him a chance to rewrite his story. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. The morning after the announcement, La Belle Maison felt strangely quiet. The usual chatter of waiters setting tables, the faint hum of music, even the smell of freshly brewed coffee seemed dull. The staff whispered in nervous tones about their future. Some feared layoffs, others hoped a new owner might save the restaurant. But for Eli Carter, the words "for sale" echoed louder than anything else. He couldn't stop thinking about it. The restaurant that had once been a symbol of his humiliation was now a fragile empire on the edge of collapse. For years, it had represented everything he wasn't allowed to have: status, wealth, respect. And now, for the first time, the walls that separated him from it were beginning to crack. Eli went about his day as usual, cleaning tables, serving customers, taking orders. But his mind was elsewhere. He observed everything with new eyes: the cracks in the marble floor, the flickering lights, the way the kitchen often ran out of key ingredients. The restaurant's decline wasn't sudden, it was slow and silent, built on years of neglect. The owners had become too comfortable, too proud to notice the decay. That night, Eli went home to his small apartment and opened his worn notebook, the one where he had been keeping his dreams alive. On every page were ideas how to improve service, cut costs, attract new customers. He had spent years studying restaurants that thrived and those that failed. Now, he finally had a chance to use everything he'd learned. He started running the numbers. He knew the restaurant was worth more than he could afford, but he also knew that struggling businesses could often be bought for less, especially if the owners were desperate to sell. He began reaching out quietly, talking to people he'd met through his catering work, event organizers, small investors, community leaders who respected his integrity and hard work. At first, most people dismissed him. Some laughed at the idea of a waiter buying one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city. But Eli didn't let that discourage him. He kept making calls, sending proposals, pitching his plan. Every rejection only sharpened his resolve. Weeks passed and whispers spread among the staff. Some thought he was foolish, others admired his courage. Even the manager, who once ignored the cruelty Eli endured, began to notice his determination. She warned him that the restaurant's debts were higher than anyone realized, that taking over could ruin him financially. But Eli only smiled and said nothing. He wasn't chasing revenge, at least not the kind people expected. He wasn't dreaming of humiliating anyone. He was dreaming of something greater: transformation. To take a place built on arrogance and prejudice and turn it into a space that celebrated dignity and respect. Still, doubt haunted him. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he questioned himself. Was he reaching too high? Was he setting himself up for another kind of failure? He thought about his mother then. Her tired hands, her quiet strength. She had believed in him when no one else did. That belief had to mean something. A month later, the opportunity came. The owners announced an official sale and Eli saw the listing price. It was lower than he expected, but still far beyond what he had saved. He met with a banker who, upon hearing his story, politely dismissed him. "You're a waiter," the man said, not unkindly, but with the same finality that so many had used before. Eli left that meeting with a heavy heart, but not with defeat. He took a deep breath and kept searching. He began presenting his catering business's success as proof of his capability. He gathered testimonials from clients who praised his professionalism. He built a business plan so detailed that even skeptical investors had to take a second look. Then, unexpectedly, help came from a place he didn't anticipate. A retired chef named Mr. Donnelly, who had once worked at La Belle Maison before its decline, reached out after hearing about Eli's plan. Donnelly had watched the restaurant lose its soul under greedy owners and saw something familiar in Eli's ambition: the hunger to restore meaning. The old chef introduced him to a small group of investors who supported minority-owned businesses. It wasn't easy. Every meeting was a battle of perception. Eli had to prove himself over and over, to convince wealthy men in tailored suits that a young black waiter had the vision and discipline to turn a failing restaurant into a success story. But he came prepared for every question, every doubt. He spoke not from anger, but from purpose. After weeks of negotiations, the investors agreed to partner with him, on one condition: Eli would have to manage everything himself: operations, marketing, finances. It was risky, but he didn't hesitate. He signed the deal, using every dollar he'd saved, every bit of credit he could gather, and the faith of those who believed in him. When the papers were finalized, Eli walked back to La Belle Maison one last time as an employee. He looked around the dining room, the chandeliers, the tables where he had been laughed at and ignored. The same manager who once overlooked him congratulated him nervously, unsure what to say. That night, after closing hours, he stood alone in the center of the restaurant. For a moment, it didn't feel real. The silence was thick, almost reverent. He ran his hand across a table where he'd once been humiliated and felt something inside him shift. This was no longer a place of shame. It was a symbol of everything he had overcome. But his victory wasn't complete yet. The restaurant was failing for a reason. He had to rebuild it from the ground up: new menu, new staff culture, new vision. The real work was only beginning. Eli started by rehiring people who had been overlooked. Young cooks, waiters, and servers from diverse backgrounds, people who just needed a chance like he once did. He renovated the space, changing the decor from pretentious luxury to warm elegance. He replaced the old French menu with one that fused soul food and fine dining, paying homage to his roots while appealing to a modern crowd. Slowly, word began to spread. The new La Belle Maison, now renamed Eli Carter, was not just a restaurant, it was a movement. Customers who once ignored him now waited weeks for reservations. The same critics who once dined with contempt returned to write glowing reviews about the bold new ownership that transformed tradition with soul. But the most satisfying moment was yet to come, because in success, fate has a way of circling back. One evening, while reviewing reservations, Eli noticed a familiar name: Richard Langford, the lawyer who had mocked him years ago. He had booked a table for a high-profile business dinner. Eli sat back in his chair, a slow, quiet smile forming on his face. The man who once reduced him to a joke was about to walk into his restaurant, unaware of who truly owned it. And for the first time in his life, Eli felt no anger, only a calm, steady satisfaction. The stage for poetic justice was set. The evening air carried a familiar chill, the kind that seemed to whisper of old memories. The restaurant's tall windows glowed warmly against the night, and the elegant gold lettering of Eli Carter shimmered under the soft glow of streetlights. Inside, the air buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the faint aroma of caramelized butter and rosemary. It was opening week's fifth night, and fully booked, just like the others. Eli stood near the entrance, dressed in a tailored black suit that carried quiet authority. His posture was composed, his expression calm. No one would have guessed that just a few years earlier, he had walked those same floors in a waiter's uniform, enduring laughter that burned holes in his pride. As he scanned the reservation list for the evening, his eyes caught the name again: Richard Langford, table for 4, 800 p.m. The same Richard who had once called him boy, who had smirked while tossing a $1 bill onto a table and told him to smile. Eli's heart gave one slow, steady beat of recognition. He had been waiting for this moment, though not out of vengeance. He wanted only to see it. The subtle shock on Richard's face when he realized the man he once mocked now owned the space he walked into. When 800 arrived, the doors opened, and in came Richard and his colleagues. He hadn't changed much. The same confident swagger, the same crisp suit, and that same self-assured smirk that seemed to say the world owed him deference. His companions, a younger associate and 2 clients, followed his lead, laughing loudly, unaware of the irony that awaited them. They were greeted by the maitre d', who led them through the dining room, past the soft light and hushed elegance, to a corner table. Every detail of the restaurant, The soft jazz, the warm colors, the carefully chosen artwork reflected Eli's vision. This was not a place but to impress the powerful anymore. It was a place built to honor dignity, effort, and soul. From the corner of his eye, Eli watched as Richard glanced around, impressed but clearly unaware. He ordered wine as though he owned the place, speaking to the staff in that same dismissive tone that Eli remembered too well. The head server approached Eli discreetly and whispered that one of the guests at table 7 had requested to meet the owner. It was Richard. Of course, the man had always loved to meet important people. Eli took a slow breath and nodded. He wasn't nervous, not anymore. The years of humiliation had tempered him like steel and fire. He walked calmly toward the table. The laughter began to fade as the men turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes. Richard looked up with polite indifference, and then froze. For a split second, recognition failed him. Then, like the shadow of an old memory surfacing, the smirk slipped from his face. The laughter at the table died completely. Eli didn't speak. He simply smiled, calm, confident, and unshaken. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable for Eli, but heavy for everyone else. The waiter they once mocked now stood before them as the owner of the restaurant they had come to admire. Richard's colleagues glanced between them, sensing the tension but not understanding its depth. Eli nodded courteously, thanked them for visiting, and turned to the head server, giving quiet instructions for their table to receive the best service of the night on the house. Then he walked away, leaving Richard to sit in silence, a red flush creeping up his neck. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. Eli hadn't humiliated him, hadn't said a word. But his silence spoke volumes. Power, dignity, and success radiated from his composure, and that quiet grace was sharper than any insult could ever be. As the evening went on, the room filled again with laughter and soft conversation. But at table 7, the mood was uneasy. Richard tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the rhythm of his voice faltered, his confidence cracked. The others whispered when he wasn't looking. They had seen something in Eli's eyes, strength and the unspoken story behind it. Later that night, as the guests began to leave, Richard lingered behind, walking slowly toward the exit. He stopped by the front desk, hesitating, and glanced toward Eli, who was signing invoices near the host stand. Their eyes met again. There was no hostility, no anger, just quiet acknowledgement. A mirror reflecting years of imbalance now set right. Richard muttered a stiff, "good night," barely audible before stepping into the cold air outside. Eli watched him go without satisfaction or resentment. The truth was, he didn't need to see the man crumble. He didn't need to hear an apology. The simple fact that the tables had turned, naturally, without cruelty, was enough. Over the next few weeks, Eli Carter flourished. Reviews poured in, praising not only the cuisine but the atmosphere. A place where everyone felt welcome, from business executives to everyday workers. People wrote about how it felt different, not just elegant, but human. Behind the success, however, Eli carried quiet scars. He often thought about how close he had come to giving up years ago, how one more cruel night could have broken his spirit. The memory reminded him to stay humble, to protect those who worked for him from ever feeling what he once felt. He treated his employees like family. He listened to their concerns, encouraged their ideas, and rewarded their efforts. Many of them were from backgrounds that society often overlooked: immigrants, single parents, young people trying to build a future. Under his leadership, they didn't just serve food, they built stories of pride and belonging. But the past has a way of testing peace. A few months later, a new opportunity and a new challenge appeared. A luxury restaurant chain approached Eli, proposing a partnership. They wanted to expand Eli Carter into a franchise, offering huge profits and national recognition. It was tempting, but something about their tone made Eli cautious. They spoke of elevating his brand, but their vision stripped away everything he had built. They wanted the prestige, not the purpose. And when Eli refused to compromise the integrity of his restaurant, subtle pressure began. Negative reviews appeared online. Rumors started spreading. Competitors tried to poach his staff. It was as if the world that had once mocked him couldn't stand to see him thrive on his own terms. Eli faced the challenge head-on. He called meetings, reassured his team, and stayed transparent. He reminded them of what Eli Carter stood for: respect, community, resilience. But as the weeks went on, the attacks grew more personal. Anonymous letters, online accusations, and whispers about his past as a waiter resurfaced. It was no longer about business. It was about power. Someone wanted to remind him that no matter how far he had come, he wasn't supposed to forget where he started. But Eli had learned long ago that when life pushed him down, he didn't fall. He rose higher. He began gathering evidence, tracing the false reviews and rumors back to their source. And when he finally uncovered the name behind the sabotage, his heart sank with disbelief. It was Richard Langford, the same man who had once mocked him, dined in his restaurant, and walked away quietly humiliated. Now trying to destroy what he had built, Eli closed his eyes and let the realization sink in. Fate, it seemed, wasn't finished with their story yet, and this time it wouldn't end with silence. The morning after Eli discovered Richard Langford's name tied to the smear campaign, the world felt quieter, but heavier. The sunlight filtered through his office blinds in thin, golden slats falling across the desk where documents, invoices, and screenshots lay scattered. Each piece of evidence told a story, a trail of deceit, whispers of sabotage, and one man's attempt to reclaim a power he once held over another. Eli sat back in his chair, calm but alert, his mind running through every possible explanation. He had always believed in fairness, in taking the higher road. But this was different. Richard wasn't just trying to hurt him. He was trying to erase everything Eli had built from years of sweat and humiliation. The false reviews had started small. Claims that service had slipped, that the food was pretentious, that the owner was rude to regular customers. Then came more vicious attacks, fake allegations of health code violations, fabricated staff complaints, even doctored photos that made the restaurant appear unsanitary. Within a month, reservations had dropped by 20%. Eli's first instinct had been patience. He trusted the strength of his reputation. But patience had its limits, and now he had proof. Each fake review traced back to a cluster of anonymous accounts linked through an IP address belonging to a law firm. Langford and Pierce, Richard's company. He wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. The man who once looked down on him from a place of arrogance was now stooping to ruin him in secret. Perhaps humiliation had curdled into resentment. Perhaps Richard couldn't stand seeing a man he once considered beneath him succeed. Whatever the reason, Eli knew what came next. He didn't rush into revenge. Instead, he studied Richard's world carefully, just as he had once studied LaBelle Mason. He researched the law firm's clients, their financial status, and their recent public image. What he discovered was an empire that looked pristine from the outside, but was cracking underneath. Langford and Pierce had recently been accused of shady business dealings, rumors of client exploitation, unethical contracts, and misuse of funds. Nothing confirmed yet, but all it needed was a spark. Eli wasn't going to destroy him out of bitterness. He was going to let truth speak for itself. He reached out to a journalist who had once covered his restaurant's rise, a woman known for investigating corruption and injustice. He provided her with evidence of the fake reviews, the connections to the law firm, and copies of the anonymous messages he had received. She was skeptical at first, but intrigued. The idea of a powerful lawyer trying to sabotage a black entrepreneur out of spite was a story that demanded daylight. Over the next few weeks, she began her investigation quietly, cross-referencing sources and reaching out to former employees of Langford and Pierce. What she uncovered went beyond petty revenge, hidden transactions, intimidation tactics, and a pattern of silencing competitors. Meanwhile, Eli focused on his team. He refused to let fear spread. He gathered his staff and explained everything honestly, from the attacks to the investigation. "They want us to doubt ourselves," he said, standing in the kitchen as the smell of simmering garlic and herbs filled the air. "But we don't run from truth. We build from it." His honesty strengthened them. The staff rallied, posting videos of their work, sharing behind-the-scenes stories about the restaurant's values and culture. Customers began returning, drawn not just by the food but by the integrity of the people behind it. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Then one morning, the story broke. The headline spread across every major news outlet. Prominent lawyer under fire for targeted harassment of black business owner. The article laid everything bare. The smear campaign, the IP trace, the fake accounts, and the history of questionable behavior inside Richard's firm. Screenshots flooded social media. People who once dined beside Richard now publicly distanced themselves. Former clients came forward with their own stories of manipulation and deceit. Within hours, Richard Langford's carefully crafted image began to crumble. At first, he denied everything. He released a statement claiming the accusations were fabricated, that Eli had orchestrated it for publicity. But the evidence was too solid. When the journalist released the digital forensics, proving the connection between his office network and the false reviews, denial was no longer an option. The board of Langford and Pierce suspended him within days. The firm's investors pulled out. The same media outlets that once praised him for his legal brilliance now dissected his moral collapse. Eli watched it all unfold with mixed emotions. He hadn't expected to feel satisfaction, and he didn't. What he felt instead was clarity, the deep, unshakable knowledge that truth had its own form of justice. Richard's downfall wasn't the result of revenge, it was the consequence of his own actions finally catching up to him. Still, the human cost of it all weighed on Eli. Late one night, he walked through his restaurant after closing. The lights were dim, the last traces of laughter and warmth fading into silence. He looked at the empty tables and thought about how different his life could have been. How easily bitterness could have consumed him, how easily he could have become the very thing he despised. But he hadn't. He had stayed the course. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Richard showed up at Mason Carter. He looked nothing like the man who had once strutted through those doors in tailored suits. His shoulders slumped, his eyes tired, his confidence shattered. He asked quietly if he could speak to Eli. Eli's instinct was to say no, but he didn't. He nodded and led Richard to a quiet corner table, the same table where their story had once reversed. Richard apologized, not in the way people apologize to fix things, but in the way a man speaks when he finally sees himself clearly. He admitted to his jealousy, to the anger he couldn't let go of. He said he had spent his life building walls of superiority, and when Eli's success cracked those walls, he panicked. Eli listened. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. When Richard finished, Eli simply stood and said, "I forgive you." There was no anger in his voice, no pride. Just calm truth. Forgiveness wasn't weakness, it was freedom, and Eli had earned his. Richard left quietly. A few weeks later, his firm dissolved completely. The man who once mocked a waiter had become a cautionary tale about arrogance and prejudice. Meanwhile, Mason Carter continued to rise. Business flourished beyond expectations. The restaurant became a symbol of resilience and redemption, featured in magazines and documentaries as a story of strength, not vengeance. But Eli didn't chase fame. He remained grounded, always reminding his team that their purpose wasn't to prove worth to anyone. It was to honor the work, the food, and the people they served. Still, there was one last twist to fate's story. Months after Richard's downfall, a charity organization approached Eli with a proposal to help fund mentorship programs for disadvantaged youth, programs that taught entrepreneurship and hospitality. One of the sponsors, a donation from an anonymous source, later revealed to be Richard Langford. Eli smiled when he heard the news. It seemed even broken men could find redemption when faced with truth. The waiter they laughed at had not only bought the restaurant, he had changed the story entirely. But his journey wasn't over yet. For success, as Eli would soon learn, comes with its own kind of test, one that would force him to confront what he valued most. Success had a strange silence to it, the kind that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion. Months after Richard Langford's downfall, Mason Carter had become more than just a restaurant, it had become a landmark. Reporters called it triumph of grace over prejudice. Influencers posted about its food, its message, and its humble owner who had risen from waiter to restaurateur. Eli Carter's name was now spoken with admiration. He was invited to business panels, charity galas, and television interviews. His story, the man they laughed at who bought the restaurant, had become a symbol of poetic justice. But beneath the glitter of recognition, Eli felt a growing tension he couldn't ignore. Fame, he realized, was a double-edged sword. It celebrated you, but it also changed everything around you. The restaurant that once felt like home now carried the weight of expectation. Every night, new faces filled the dining hall, most of them there not just for the food but for the story. They wanted to meet the man who overcame racism. They wanted photos, autographs, a piece of his narrative. And though Eli greeted them with grace, he couldn't help but notice how the attention sometimes diluted the heart of what he had built. The warmth that had once defined Mason Carter, the laughter among staff, the genuine care between kitchen and guests, began to fade under pressure. His employees worked longer hours, his managers struggled to keep up with demand, and the spirit of family he'd worked so hard to build started to fracture beneath the weight of success. Eli saw it happening but didn't know how to stop it. Growth came fast. Too fast. Investors called daily urging him to open new locations. Magazines wanted exclusives. Celebrities wanted private dining experiences. What had once been a dream now felt like a storm. And through it all, Eli barely slept. He lived in his office, spending nights reviewing invoices, negotiating contracts, and approving expansion plans. His catering company had doubled in size. His restaurant was booked months in advance. From the outside, he looked unstoppable, a beacon of victory. But on the inside, something sacred was slipping away. One evening, as the dinner rush quieted and the last guests left, Eli walked through the empty dining room. The chandeliers glowed softly, casting gold reflections on the polished tables. He thought of the early days, when he stayed after hours cleaning those same tables as a waiter, when dreams were enough to keep him going. Now, even surrounded by success, he felt strangely hollow. He sat down at one of the tables, his head heavy. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of the street outside filled the silence. His phone vibrated again. Another message from an investor pushing for expansion. He didn't reply. He stared at the screen until the light dimmed and went black. He had built everything he once prayed for. But in the process, he was losing the part of himself that had built it. A few days later, he got a call from his old friend and mentor, Mr. Donnelly. The retired chef who had once believed in his vision. Donnelly congratulated him on his success, but his tone carried concern. "Success," he said gently, "isn't about how far you rise. It's about what you keep intact on the way up." The words stayed with Eli. That night, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was drifting from the very values that had saved him. The humility, the respect, the community. So, he decided to reconnect with the roots that had grounded him. He began visiting local community centers again, the same ones that had once supported his early catering business. He volunteered to teach cooking classes to teenagers from underprivileged neighborhoods. At first, the kids didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another man showing them how to hold a knife properly or season a pan with confidence. But as the lessons went on, they opened up. They talked about their struggles, their dreams, and their fears of not being seen, of being underestimated, overlooked, or judged by their skin color or background. Eli listened, and something inside him rekindled. He saw himself in those faces, the same hunger to be more, the same fear of being told, "You can't." And as he taught them, he realized that true success wasn't about owning restaurants or earning headlines. It was about lifting others so they wouldn't have to endure what he once did. Inspired, Eli launched a new initiative through Eli Carter, a culinary mentorship program for marginalized youth. The program offered internships, training, and scholarships to help young people start careers in hospitality. It became an extension of his restaurant's soul, proof that from pain could come purpose. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in. News outlets covered the story with admiration. But most importantly, the staff at Eli Carter felt renewed. They remembered why they were there, not just to serve food, but to be part of something meaningful. Yet, even as the light returned to his life, fate wasn't done testing him. 6 months later, Eli received news that the building Eli Carter occupied was being sold. The property owner, a large development firm, planned to demolish it and build luxury apartments. They offered to buy out Eli's lease early with compensation, but no promise of relocation. It was a devastating blow. The restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a monument of his journey, the place where his pain had turned into power. Losing it would mean losing a piece of his history. Eli spent sleepless nights looking for solutions. The investors suggested he move operations to a new, modern location, a bigger one, more profitable. But he couldn't bear the thought. Eli Carter was more than walls and tables, it was memory. He considered fighting the sale, but the developers were powerful, their lawyers relentless. For the first time in years, he felt the same helplessness he had once known as a waiter, watching decisions about his life being made in rooms he wasn't invited into. But Eli was not the same man he once was. He decided to fight back, not through anger, but through unity. He gathered his staff, his students, and the community he had uplifted. He shared his story again, not as a victim, but as a builder who refused to see his work erased. Word spread quickly. Local news stations picked it up. Customers, neighbors, and supporters launched a campaign to save Eli Carter. Protests formed outside the developers' offices, peaceful but powerful. The city began to take notice. Letters poured in from people across the country, describing how Eli's story had inspired them. It became more than a business matter. It became a symbol, a battle between greed and grace, between destruction and preservation. For weeks, negotiations dragged on. The developers underestimated the strength of public opinion. Investors threatened to pull funding from their projects. And finally, one morning, Eli received a call from the city council. The development permit was on hold. The building was to be preserved as a protected landmark, a recognition of cultural and community value. Eli sat in silence as he heard the words. Relief washed over him slowly, not in waves of joy, but in quiet gratitude. He had saved Eli Carter, not for himself, but for everyone it represented. The night the news broke, the restaurant was filled with celebration. Staff laughed, music played softly, and Eli stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed. He looked around and realized that for the first time in a long time, the laughter wasn't heavy, it was free. But deep inside, he sensed there was still one final chapter waiting, one last test to close the circle. Because stories like his didn't just end in victory. They ended in legacy. Morning sunlight poured through the windows of Eli Carter, casting long golden streaks across the dining room. The place was alive with quiet joy, not the chaotic energy of opening week or the nervous buzz of success, but a peace that came only after survival. The walls that had once witnessed humiliation now stood tall as symbols of victory. The air carried not tension, but belonging. It had been 2 years since the fight to save the restaurant. The campaign had changed everything, not just for Eli Carter, but for the entire city. Eli Carter was now officially recognized as a cultural landmark, and a bronze plaque outside told visitors the story of the man who turned pain into purpose. Tourists came to dine, yes, but they also came to remember. Eli had grown into a new role. He was no longer just the man who bought the restaurant where he was once laughed at. He had become a mentor, a leader, a quiet force in the world of culinary justice. His program for underprivileged youth had expanded nationwide, helping hundreds of young people enter the hospitality industry with dignity and hope. Yet, as much as Eli's world had grown, he never forgot where it began. He still walked through the kitchen every morning, greeting each staff member by name, reminding them that no matter how successful they became, kindness was the foundation they stood on. The city outside had changed too. People spoke differently about race, class, and opportunity, not perfectly, but better than before. Eli's story had inspired uncomfortable conversations and beautiful change. The same streets that once echoed with laughter at his expense now echoed with respect for what he built. But fate, as always, had its own way of circling back. One evening, as Eli was finishing paperwork in his office, his assistant knocked gently and handed him a letter. It was handwritten, rare these days, and the name on the envelope made Eli freeze, Richard Langford. For a moment, he simply stared at the name, the memory of that night years ago flashing through his mind. The laughter, the humiliation, the sharp sting of shame that had once burned into his bones. He took a deep breath, then opened the envelope. Inside was a short letter written in a shaky but deliberate hand. Richard was now an old man. He wrote that after losing his restaurant, his marriage, and much of his wealth, he had spent years reflecting on the kind of man he'd been. He confessed that he had been cruel, arrogant, and blinded by his own privilege. He had lost everything, and perhaps, he said, that was the justice he deserved. But at the end of the letter, he wrote something Eli didn't expect he wanted to meet. Not to ask for anything, but to apologize to face before it was too late. Eli sat in silence for a long time after reading it. Part of him felt a flicker of anger, that this man who had once reduced him to nothing now sought forgiveness as if it were easy to grant. But another part of him, the part that had built Eli Carter on grace rather than revenge, knew what he had to do. A week later, Eli visited the small assisted living home where Richard now lived. The man who once strutted through fine dining halls with pride now sat quietly by a window, thin and frail, his eyes tired but sincere. When he saw Eli, tears filled them before a word was spoken. Eli didn't speak either. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been lived. The silence between them carried years of pain and growth. Richard finally murmured an apology, his voice breaking. He said he had been haunted by that night for years. The way he'd treated Eli, the way he'd let his own fear and arrogance define him. He said losing everything had been the best punishment life could have given him, because it forced him to see the truth. Eli listened, his heart heavy. He realized something profound in that moment, that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had been done, but about freeing yourself from what had been holding you back. He didn't respond with anger or pity. Instead, he simply placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. The old man wept silently, and Eli let him. When he left that day, Eli felt lighter. The ghosts that had followed him for so long had finally been laid to rest. Karma had already done its work. All that remained was peace. Months passed and life moved forward. Mason Carter continued to thrive, but Eli began thinking about what would come next. He had achieved everything he'd once dreamed of: success, recognition, redemption. But now he thought about legacy. He started planning for the future, not in terms of expansion or profit, but in terms of impact. He wanted the restaurant to live beyond him, to remain a safe space for generations after he was gone. So he decided to establish the Carter Culinary Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to training marginalized youth in fine dining and entrepreneurship. The foundation would ensure that no dreamer with potential would ever be told they don't belong again. The announcement came with fanfare, but Eli's heart remained grounded. He stood on the same stage where he'd once received an award for business excellence and spoke softly, without ego. He said the world didn't need more fancy restaurants. It needed more fair chances. The audience rose in applause, but Eli only smiled humbly, knowing that applause wasn't the point anymore. On the 5th anniversary of Mason Carter, the staff threw a private celebration. Old faces returned. Former employees, friends, and even customers who had witnessed the restaurant's early days. Laughter filled the air again, warm and genuine. At one point, Eli stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and he looked up at the sign above the door. The name that once seemed impossible now glowing softly against the night sky. He thought about the young man he had once been, the waiter cleaning tables while enduring cruel laughter. He thought about the nights of doubt, the days of struggle, and the moment he decided to rise instead of surrender. Everything had come full circle. Just then, a group of young trainees from his mentorship program walked past, laughing and talking about their shifts. One of them stopped and turned to him, eyes wide with admiration. The boy said he wanted to open his own restaurant one day, one that made people feel the way Mason Carter did. Eli smiled and nodded, his heart full. That was it, the true reward. Not revenge, not success, but the spark passed forward. As he watched the boy disappear down the street, Eli whispered to himself that the story was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, everyone who had ever been underestimated, everyone who had ever been laughed at for simply existing. And that night, as the restaurant glowed behind him, Eli Carter finally felt the peace of a man who had not only survived prejudice, but transformed it into purpose. The laughter that once broke him had become the melody of his triumph.